Welcome back to Remnants of the Veil, Episode 17. A war that has not been declared does not advance. It spreads. It moves into the spaces other ambitions vacate, and it learns the shape of the board by pressing on every edge until one of them gives. Warlord Veskaar had pressed. The edge he chose had held, and what came back to him was not territory, but a record, 57 pages of it, distributed to every clan in the compact, documenting in the compact's own unforgiving language exactly how much a reach could cost, and exactly how little it could buy. A failed reach is not a private failure. In the compact, it is an invitation. The board did not wait for Veskaar to recover. It was already moving. Skethaal kept nothing it did not use. Where the other clan worlds wore their history, Kethara's halls hung with the weapons of dead overlords, Vorkath's sky burning a permanent orange over forges that never cooled. Skethaal had been scoured, down to function and left there. No monuments, no trophies. The fortress that housed Clan Morvaak's command was a low gray structure set into the rock, its lines unbroken by ornament, its corridors lit to exactly the level required to walk them, and no brighter. Above it, the fleet sat at dock. It was the smallest fleet of the 5 clans. It was also the only one at full operational strength. Every vessel fueled, every crew current. Nothing held in reserve because nothing had been spent. Other warlords read the size of Clan Morvaak's fleet and saw a clan that could not threaten them. Warlord Morvaak had spent a lifetime allowing them to. The discipline showed in what Skethaal did not produce. No drills run for the watching of them. No fleet maneuvers staged where another clan's sensors would log the competence. Clan Morvaak trained in the dark of its own systems and kept the results to itself. Orders moved through the command in the fewest words that would carry them. A Morvaak officer who needed a thing said twice was an officer who would not hold his post the following season. The fleet at dock was the method made visible. Every other clan measured its strength by what it could put in motion. Warlord Morvaak measured his by what he could hold still. Fueled, crewed, ready, spending nothing, owing nothing, available entire on the day it was worth applying. A blade kept sheathed, took no nicks. He kept his sheathed. He sat in a room that held a chair, a desk, and the battle record. Nothing else, no window. The command levels were below the rock, where the temperature held constant and the light did not change with the hours. No weapon mounted on the wall. Warlord Morvaak did not display the instruments of his victories because to display a thing was to tell other men what you valued, and what you valued was the first thing they would come to take. His bone plating was polished smooth. Other Drakkar found it unsettling. A warrior's plating was meant to carry his scars, and a warlord with no visible history was either a man who had never been tested or a man who had removed the evidence. Both readings made other men careful. Warlord Morvaak permitted both and corrected neither. He read the record the way he did everything, once, completely, without moving. The engagement itself held nothing for him. 7 ships against 7, AI. Corridor mouth, a forcing action executed with competence by a captain named Grethkar who was barely 60 and flew like a man who would be a problem for a decade. Veskaar had lost. The manner of the loss was already written down. There was no use in rereading a conclusion. What held him sat in the margins. 3 things. The first was that Warlord Thorruk had begun to move. Nothing crossed the open channels. Thorruk was a follower, not a fool, and a follower does not announce. But Clan Drennoc's transit posture had shifted in the days since the record circulated, ships repositioning along the Vorraan approach in a pattern that resolved, if you watched it long enough, into a single intention. The Vorraan Junction sat on Drennoc's own outer transit route. Warlord Veskaar had claimed it and could no longer hold it. Warlord Thorruk was going to take what Veskaar had dropped, not as a bid for the Overlord's dais, but the way a man retrieves something useful. That has fallen at his feet. Low risk, his own ground, free. Morvaak read the shape of it in the transit logs the way other men read a face. Drennoc had moved no battle line, only repositioned standing traffic. 2 battle cruisers eased off their patrol circuits onto the core, outer transit route under cover of a routine rotation. 4 light cruisers thinned from the approach screens and did not return to them. A flight of boarding pods, which no clan moved for any purpose but one, slid quietly into the rear of a supply formation. The tonnage was enough to take a tripwire and not 1 ton more. That was the whole of Korak in a single disposition. He had measured the cost of the junction exactly, committed exactly that, and arranged every hull so the warlord himself need never appear in the record of it. It told Morvaak what Korak wanted, which was the junction. It told him just as plainly what Korak was not. A man who would ever risk more than the safe thing in front of him was worth. A clan that took only what fell could not be made to overcommit, which made it harmless, and could not be made to gamble, which made it small. He filed the ceiling and the appetite together, where the two of them would stay. There was nothing in it to admire and nothing in it to fear. A follower acting on weakness was the most predictable thing a clan could do. The second thing was that Warlord Veskaar had done nothing. This was not the same as a Morvaak doing nothing, and the distinction was the whole of the difference between them. Veskaar's stillness was doctrine, the second position, held by a man who let the ambitions of others clarify the terrain before he committed his own. It was sound. It was also legible. Warlord Morvaak could see exactly what Veskaar was waiting, for which meant Veskaar was, in the only way that mattered, already spent, his next move written by other men's choices before he had made it. Veskaar's stillness was as legible as Korak's motion, and Morvaak had read it as fast. Clan Sheathed had deployed nothing. Its line sat at home anchorage at full readiness and did not move a hull. Its channels had gone quiet. No claims filed, no positions argued, no correspondence answered past the formal minimum. To a careless eye, it looked like strength held in reserve. It was the opposite. Veskaar was waiting for the field to narrow, for Veskaar to fall, for Korak to commit, for Thorruk to consolidate or fracture, so he could enter against 2 or 3 live contenders and apply his strength where it would decide rather than merely contend. The discipline of it was real. So was the confession buried inside it. A man who would only move once the choices had been made for him had handed the timing of his own war to every other warlord in the compact, and did not appear to know that a warlord whose moment is chosen for him is no longer choosing anything. His own stillness was not waiting. He intended to keep that distinction his. The third thing was the only line in 57 pages worth keeping. The ship quality. Veskaar's ships had been compromised. The record laid it out without flourish. A drift in the correction timing. A secondary mass displacement signature consistent across 3 volleys, plating that was not what plating from Clan Vesk's yard should have been. Veskaar had seen it during the engagement and used it. Thorruk had seen it afterward and could not explain it. The question sat in the record with no answer attached. Why would a warlord commit compromised ships to an engagement he knew would be recorded and read by every clan in the compact? Warlord Morvaak read the question. He did not answer it. He could have. There were perhaps 4 explanations, and 3 of them could be eliminated inside a week with information Clan Morvaak already held, or could quietly acquire. He chose to acquire none of it. To investigate was to act. And to act was to be seen acting, and the value of the question did not live in its answer. It lived in the fact that Thorruk had asked it, Korak had not noticed it, and Veskaar would file it and wait. Veskaar's yards had produced something they should not have produced, or produced it on purpose, and somewhere in that lay a thread that would, when pulled at the correct moment by the correct hand, unmake Clan Vesk from the inside. The explanations had arranged themselves without his asking. 3 were mundane. The plating fault was real, and Veskaar had not known, his yards failing him and lacking the integrity to say so. Or the fault was real, and Veskaar had known, and spent the ships regardless, hulls he could no longer trust, committed because he had nothing better left to commit. Or the compromised hulls were not Vesk-built at all, but refits dressed in Vesk colors, the drift a fingerprint of another yard's hand. The 4th was not mundane, and it was the only one that held him. That the fault was no fault but a signature, laid into the metal on purpose, for an eye that knew to look. Though to whom, and saying what, nothing in the record would show. The first 3 opened doors he could walk through unseen. The fourth opened nothing he could stand on, which was precisely why he kept it shut. The yards would keep. So, in time, would whatever they had shipped. The moment was not now. The hand would not be seen reaching. He left the thread where it lay. Then Warlord Morvaak made the one decision that Skethaal would transmit that day. He stood the fleet down. Across the compact, readiness was rising. Korak's ships were moving. Veskaar was reconstituting what remained. To him, Thorruk was binding together a clan that had nearly come apart in his absence. Rathak was watching, which for Rathak was a posture of readiness all its own. Every clan was tightening. Warlord Morvaak loosened. He brought his patrols in from the contested approaches. He returned to dock the vessels that had been holding station at the edges of Clan Morvaak's space. He reduced his clan's visible activity to the lowest level it had shown in a full succession interval, and he did it openly, on the routine logistics channels any clan could monitor, where it would read as exactly what every warlord already believed about Clan Morvaak. That the smallest clan was sitting the succession out, as it always had, conserving itself to bow to whoever won. What the stand-down actually did, no channel recorded. It rested his crews while the others burned theirs. It drew his full-strength fleet into a single instrument while the others scattered theirs across flashpoints. It lifted Clan Morvaak clear of every position where an action might later be laid at his door, and it cost nothing, committed to nothing, and revealed nothing, which was the only kind of move he had ever been willing to make. He could imagine how the stand-down read in 4 other command rooms, and the imagining was its own kind of confirmation. To Korak, one less rival on the route he meant to take. To Veskaar, scrambling to reconstitute, the one warlord not circling the wound. To Rathak, a man holding the second position more patiently than Rathak managed himself, which would unsettle Rathak in a way he would not admit. To Thorruk, silence, which Thorruk alone had the instinct to fear correctly and not the leverage to answer. 4 readings, everyone wrong in the way that served him, and not a word of it anything he had said. The other warlords feared Warlord Thorruk's aggression. They had learned to. They feared Warlord Morvaak's silence more. And they had never quite been able to say why. A man who never reaches cannot be caught reaching. A man who is never seen to move arrives when at last he moves, from a direction no one thought to watch. Skethaal kept nothing it did not use. Warlord Morvaak intended to use all of it, once. The Vorraan Junction was older than the dispute over it. It had been a crossing before it was a question. A point where 2 hyperlane corridors met, one feeding Clan Vesk's approach, the other carrying the bulk of Clan Drenak's outer transit. At the crossing sat a station, a fixed transit control platform, raised in the years when the Charter's language was still being argued, and the matter of who owned a junction that served 2 clans had been left, through deliberation or exhaustion, unsettled. The platform regulated passage, it logged every transit, and in its authorization core it held the only continuous record of who had used the crossing and by what right, which made it not merely a position, but an instrument. Whoever held the station held the claim, not the rhetoric of the claim but the mechanism of it. Warlord Veskaar had filed his claim on open channels and sent 7 ships to the wrong fight to prove it. The 7 ships were a record now. The claim was a line of text with nothing behind it. The station was still held. Clan Dranak came for it on a transit schedule that looked until the final approach like ordinary traffic. What held the station was not a fleet. It was a garrison, a fixed complement aboard the platform, 3 light cruisers keeping station in its shadow, and the defensive batteries the platform had carried since before any living warlord's tenure turned from the regulation of traffic to the only other purpose batteries served. It was a tripwire. It had been placed to satisfy the requirement that a claim be actively contested, and it had been placed there by a warlord who no longer had the force to reinforce it and no longer had the standing to make reinforcing it mean anything. The man holding it knew this. He had known it for 2 days. Commander Druvask had read Warlord Veskaar's open-channel transmission 4 times, and each reading had told him the same thing in language built to keep him from saying it aloud, a probe of border integrity. The junction, a matter requiring arbitration. The warlord's continued interest in the legal resolution of its status. There was no order in it. No reinforcement named, no withdrawal authorized. No acknowledgement that a garrison sat aboard the station the transmission discussed as though it were a point of law rather than a place where men were about to die. Warlord Veskaar had not abandoned the junction. Abandonment would have required him to name it. He had done something colder. He had turned it into an argument, and turned Druvask and the garrison and the 3 light cruisers in the platform's shadow into the evidence that argument would cite. Druvask was not a stupid man. He understood that he was holding a position that had already failed, for a claim the compact had already read as void, on the order of a warlord who was not coming and who would describe whatever happened here in the formal register that made the dead into footnotes. He held it anyway. Not out of loyalty to Warlord Veskaar, who had earned none from him this week. Not out of belief in the claim, which he had stopped believing in when the border force did not come home. He held it because no order to leave had reached him, and a commander who abandoned a position without one was a commander the compact, remembered the wrong way. And because the authorization corps still held the transit record, and as long as he held the corps, the claim was not captured. It was only contested. That was a thin difference. It was the only one left to him, and he had decided it was worth the cost of a garrison. He had not told the garrison that part. Clan Drenok arrived in the platform's sensor range at the 11th hour of his watch. The force was measured. Not overwhelming. Warlord Thorruk had not committed the tonnage that would have made the outcome instant, because instant outcomes were expensive and a tripwire was not worth the expense. He had sent enough. 2 battle cruisers, 4 light cruisers, a flight of boarding pods held to the rear, commanded from the lead battle cruiser by an officer flying under the warlord's authority while the warlord himself stayed on Korath far from anything that could be entered against him in a record. The officer's name was Karvek. Senior Commander Karvek transmitted once on the formal channel in the language the charter required, a demand for the surrender of the station and the transfer of its authorization corps, citing Clan Drenok's transit rights and the lapse of Clan Vesk's active contestation. Druvask did not answer it. To answer was to enter the argument, and he had decided the only answer he would give was the one the batteries made. He gave it. The platform's batteries had been built to wave transports through a crossing. In 2 days of work, by a crew that knew what was coming, they had been turned to the opposite purpose. The first volley caught the lead battle cruiser at the range where fixed mounts held their one advantage over a ship, that they did not have to move, and could therefore be 0 to a degree no maneuvering hull could match. 4 heavy mounts fired together. The battle cruiser's forward shielding took 3. The 4th found the seam where the forward plating met the command section, and on the platform's display, Druvask watched a section of a Drenok capital ship open to the void and vent its atmosphere and the small tumbling shapes of crew who had been at stations behind that plate. He felt nothing about it he had the time to feel. He logged it. First blood was amber, and it was theirs, and it bought him perhaps 90 seconds while the enemy commander recalculated. His 3 light cruisers came off the platform's shadow and into the geometry he had set for them. He had 3 ships, and he had positioned them not to win. Winning was not on offer, but to make the taking expensive and to buy the core every minute he could. He had tied the cruisers to the mounts rather than to the platform. A ship the batteries hit would stagger off course into a cruiser's guns. A ship that turned away from a cruiser would straighten back into the batteries. There was no lane across the approach that did not cross one or the other, and he had laid every gun he had into making that true. The Vrak took the lead battle cruiser's flank while it was still bleeding atmosphere, 2 siege cannon rounds walking up the cruiser's dorsal line. The Skarn held the lane the boarding pods would have to cross. And the Rokvar, the ship that had limped in from the border 2 days before, hull still scored from an engagement it had barely survived, crew still carrying what they had watched there, took the position no one else could, between the EI platform and the 2nd battle cruiser, because it was already too broken to be spent on anything that needed it to last. Senior Commander Karvek did not panic. The flank breach had cost him crew and a section of a capital ship and 90 seconds, and he absorbed all three and kept coming, because the mathematics had not changed, and a competent commander did not let First Blood rewrite them. He brought his light cruisers up to screen the battle cruisers and pressed the range down toward the distance where the platform's fixed mount advantage would evaporate and a moving ship's weight of fire would begin to tell. The Skarn died first. It died holding the boarding lane, exactly where Druvask had put it, under the converging fire of two Drennic light cruisers that had named it the obstacle between their pods and the station and decided to remove it before the pods committed. Captain Vethra had served the junction, garrisoned 6 years, and knew the crossing's traffic better than the charter did. She held the lane until her ship stopped being a ship. The breach, when it came, opened her bridge to the void. The display marked the Skarn lost. Druvask had 4 seconds to register that the boarding lane was now open. Then the next problem arrived, and he gave it his attention because attention was the only thing he still had to give, and the dead had no use for it. The Rokvar went next. Too broken to do anything but hold, it held, wedged between the platform and the second. Battlecruiser absorbing fire it could no longer answer until the battlecruiser broke it across a dozen impacts, and it stopped. It never left the position. It had nothing left to reach another one with. The pods launched while the lane was still clearing. Thrak class. 200 tons each of armored insertion vehicle fired across the gap on ballistic lines that did not maneuver and did not need. 4 of them. The Vrak killed one in transit, caught it with a siege cannon round that turned 200 tons of pod and the warriors sealed inside into an expanding, amber-edged cloud of metal and the matter that had been men. 3 reached the hull. 3 sets of magnetic jaws clamped onto the platform's plating with an impact Druvask felt through the deck, through his boots, up through the frame of the station, and into his teeth. The announcement of warriors who were now inside, the only thing he had left to hold. Commander Druvask pulled his garrison back to the core. The platform had not been built to be fought through. Its corridors were transit control spaces, narrow, functional, lined with the conduit and bracing of a structure meant to manage ships, not repel boarders. That served him and worked against him in equal measure. The corridors were kill funnels. He held the inner positions, and the Drennic warriors had to come to him through spaces where their numbers could not deploy. The first of them came through the breach in the outer ring at a run. Druvask met it with 6 warriors and 2 siege rifles set to fire down the corridor's length. The first Drennic through the breach took a heavy round in the chest plate at a range where the round did not so much penetrate as disassemble. The plating failed, and what was behind it failed, and the corridor wall beyond him wore the amber of it. The second came over the first, the third over the second. They knew the funnel was a funnel. They came regardless, because Senior Commander Karvek had committed them, and a committed boarding action did not have the luxury of caution. His warriors held the outer ring 11 minutes, and it cost him 4 of the 6. 11 minutes was a long time in a corridor that narrow. The funnel worked the way he had built it to, and the working of it was not clean. Drennic warriors came over their own dead because there was nowhere else to come, boots finding purchase on plating gone slick and amber, and his warriors held them at a range where a siege rifle was a club as often as a gun and a combat blade did the rest. The air thickened with the smell of opened bodies and scorched plate. A warrior beside him named Toskar took a blade low and kept firing with it still in him, because falling meant the man behind him fell too, and held another half-minute on refusal alone before the second wound put him down. Druvask did not look away. Looking away cost time, and time was the garrison, and the garrison was spending out in front of him faster than he could count it. The youngest of them was a warrior named Rek, posted to the junction because the junction was where the Compact sent warriors whose clans had nothing more pressing to do with them. He died in the outer ring with a Drennic combat blade driven through the gap beneath his arm where the plating thinned, and he took the warrior who killed him down with him, both of them amber to the elbow, neither of them old enough to have fought anything that mattered before this. Both of them spent here on a claim the Compact had already filed as void. Druvask saw it happen. He could not reach it. He fell back to the next position, because the next position was the core, and the core was the only thing his death would be permitted to mean. The authorization core was a single sealed unit in a chamber at the platform's center, the height of a man, holding the continuous transit record of the Vorraan crossing back to the years before the Charter's language had settled. It was the claim, not the rhetoric of it, the mechanism. While it held the record, and while Clan Vesk held it, the junction was contested. If Clan Drenach took it whole, they took not a station but a proof, the means to write their own transit rights into the only unbroken record the crossing had ever kept, and make the claim not contested but theirs, backward, in the compact's own ledger. Druvask reached the chamber with 2 warriors and the sound of the outer ring collapsing behind him. He did not hesitate over it. He had decided 2 days before, when the border force did not return, that if it came to the core, he would not let it be taken whole. He keyed the purge. Then there was nothing to do but wait on it, and the waiting was the hardest order he had ever given himself. He stood over the unit and counted seconds against the sound of the door behind him, the flat concussion of siege rounds, the wet sounds that meant a round had found a body, the changing rhythm of 2 warriors doing the work of 6. Every second the core took was a second the door had to last, and the door was 2 men, and he could do nothing for them but let the unit finish. The watching was the mission now. The firing had only ever been what paid for it. The purge was not quick. The core had been built to preserve, not to forget, and forgetting cost it longer than dying cost the men holding the chamber door. The 2 warriors who had come with him held that door for the length of it, and they died holding it, amber across the threshold, and the last of the Drenach boarding force came through over their bodies as the record went dark. Decades of transit logs, the unbroken proof of who had used the crossing and by what right, unmaking itself in the only act of contestation Commander Druvask had left to perform. Senior Commander Karvek's warriors took the chamber. They took Druvask in it. He did not surrender, because surrender was an argument, and he had decided the only answers he would give were the ones the batteries in the core had already made. A Drenach warrior put a siege round through him at the range where range stopped mattering. He went down amber against the dark unit that no longer held anything, and the record he had spent a garrison to erase was already gone. It was the only victory on offer, not the station, not the claim. That had been void since the border, only the difference between a thing taken and a thing denied. He had bought that difference for a warlord who would never know its price. It was enough for him. It had to be. Senior Commander Karvek secured the Vorraan Junction at the 14th hour. He held the station, the crossing, and the bodies. He had lost a section of a battle cruiser, a screening light cruiser to the Vrak before the Vrak was finally put down, 2 boarding pods and the warriors inside them, and more of his boarding force in the platform's corridors than the taking of a tripwire should ever have cost. Amber cooled on the platform's decks in the patterns it made when no one was left to clean it. Vesk and Drenach in the corridors where they had met, and the core held nothing. He transmitted his success to Korath in the language the Charter required. Warlord Thorruk received it on his own ground, far from anything that could be recorded against him, and read what it said and what it did not. Clan Drenach held the Vorraan Junction. Clan Drenach did not hold the instrument of the claim, because the instrument was gone. Purged by a commander who had understood that the place and the proof were 2 different things, and had spent his life denying Drenach the second while surrendering the first. Warlord Thorruk had taken what was free. He learned, as the followers always eventually learned, that nothing on this board was free. The Vorraan Junction belonged to Clan Drenach. The claim to it belonged to no one. Commander Druvask had spent a garrison to make those 2 sentences. True, and the only record that he had done it was the amber drying in the platform's corridors. Vesk and Drenach together, the same color now, asking the compact a question its charter had no language to answer. On Kethara, Warlord Thorruk read 2 reports in the same hour, and neither of them was a fight he could enter. The first was the Korvan position report. The bioships in the Thresh corridor had not changed their behavior. 12 of them still, drifting inward along the lane that had carried Clan Thorruk's supply traffic for 20 years, on no heading that resolved into intention, firing on nothing, demanding nothing, simply present in a space that had been his, and was now shared with 12 things that did not acknowledge the sharing. His sensor positions tracked them. His rerouted convoys avoided them. The report recommended no action because there was none to recommend. The Vorraan were not attacking, could not be bargained with, and would not, as far as anyone had ever determined, explain themselves. He filed it with the rest of what he could not act on. What unsettled him was not the 12. It was that he had stopped expecting them to do anything, and the not expecting had become an arithmetic he disliked the shape of. 12 hulls in a corridor his clan had held for 20 years, behaving like weather, and his only sane answer was to root around his own territory and call it prudence. That was a new kind of loss, and he had no doctrine for it. The second report was the Vorraan Junction. It came to him the way all of it came to him now, as a record, after the fact, of something decided by other men in a place he had not been. Clan Drenak had taken the junction. Senior Commander Karvek had commanded the taking under Warlord Korak's authority, and Warlord Thorruk had stayed on Korath, and the garrison that had held the station had been destroyed in the holding, and the authorization corps had been purged before it fell. Drenak held the crossing. The claim to it had been erased rather than transferred. Warlord Veskaar's reach had ended not in a defeat, but in something worse. In a junction his garrison had died to deny to the clan that now held it, for a claim he had already surrendered to rhetoric. Thorruk read it and understood what it meant for him, which was the only frame he had time to read it in. The succession was fragmenting faster than he could consolidate. He had spent 3 months in a formal duel and 7 interviews reassembling a clan that Vraken had quietly taken apart in his absence. He had brought 2 ships into the fold at the cost of 1. He had rewritten the emergency authority protocol, removed a border station commander, and absorbed a betrayal he could trace to Vithak's hands but not to wherever it had gone once it left them. All of it was consolidation, the slow, expensive work of making Clan Thorruk one instrument again. And while he did it, the rest of it kept breaking. Veskaar reached and failed. Korak took a junction and erased a claim. Rathak watched. Warlord Morvaak on Skethaal had gone silent in the way that Thorruk had learned to read as the most dangerous posture a warlord could take. The silence was the part that sat wrong. The others had at least declared themselves, Veskaar his desperation, Korak his ceiling, Rathak his patience, because moving men always did, whether they meant to or not. Morvaak had declared nothing. A warlord who held still, while every advantage went to the men who moved, was either beaten or was something Thorruk had no word for and no wish to find one. He did not think Morvaak was beaten, and that was the trouble. Beneath all the rest, every week he spent making one clan whole was a week the others spent becoming harder to predict. And the hardest to predict was the one doing the least, on a world that produced nothing a rival could read. There was nothing here for him to do. Korak's junction did not threaten Clan Thorruk. Veskaar's collapse did not require his answer. The Vorraan in the Thresh corridor could not be met with force, and a force committed to any of it was a force pulled off the only work keeping his clan whole. He had learned in 3 months of holding a clan together with his hands that the discipline of a strong man was not in the blows he struck. It was in the ones he declined to strike while he was not yet strong enough to strike them all. He declined. He set the Vorraan report on the Vorraan report, and both of them on the stack of things he could not yet act on, and the stack stood taller than it had a month ago, and it would stand taller still a month from now. A succession war did not wait to be ready. It did not wait for him to finish reassembling what he would need to fight it. It broke the board one piece at a time, a junction here, a claim there, a clan going quiet on a world scoured down to function, and it asked each warlord the same question it had already asked Veskaar: how much can you hold? Warlord Thorruk did not have his answer yet. He had only the work of building the hands that might one day be able to give one, and the cold certainty that while he built on a gray world that kept nothing it did not use, a warlord who never reached was counting how much everyone else had begun to drop. End of episode 17, and thank you for listening.